terrorizing and counterproductive. A new report finds the US drone program is causing great harm to Pakistani civilians and to US national security. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. The official line in the US is that its drone strikes are precise and successful in their mission to attack those deemed to be a threat to the United States.
Actually, drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties. For the most part, they have been very precise, precision strikes against Al-Qaeda.
But a new report, Living Under Drones, released by Stanford and New York universities, says that narrative is simply false. Many civilians have been killed and injured. Due to the remoteness of attack locations and government secrecy, exact figures are hard to come by. But the report judged the most credible figures to be 474 to 881 civilians killed by drones between June of 2004 and September of 2012 in Pakistan alone. It also points out that the number of high-level targets killed as a percentage of total casualties stands at just 2%. The report finds that the drones program is, quote, facilitating recruitment to violent non-state armed groups and motivated further violent attacks, end quote. In a recent poll, the Pew Research Center found that 74% of Pakistanis now consider the US an enemy. The Brave New Foundation released a video to accompany the Living Under Drones study, highlighting the central contention of the report, that the US policy is terrorizing the civilian population of northwest Pakistan.
One of the things we found is that there are entire communities who live in areas where drones are flying overhead 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at times. And these people don't know when those drones will strike. They don't know who they will strike.
The
result is symptoms of psychological disorder, of trauma, of severe anxiety, and of dysfunctionality. We heard stories of people who won't leave their houses.
The drones شیماده دازمون په علاقه باندې لکه ډېر زیات اثر یې ورزولې دي. اکثر خلک باندې دومره زیات ذهني پرشر نه چول شوی دی چې پېښور ته ډاکټران ته دي درومي.
When we interviewed psychiatrists and psychologists who had treated people with these symptoms, they said that a number of people displayed very serious symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD.
So what are the consequences of the US drone program? To discuss this, we're joined from Stanford University by Omar Shakir. He's one of the researchers who worked on the Living Under Drones report, and he conducted many of the interviews in northwest Pakistan. Here in the studio, Christine Fair. She's an assistant professor at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University. Also joining us, Robert Grenier, former director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Omar, first of all, then tell us a bit more about this report. Some of this information, I suppose we did know, but it's been collated very well in the report. But what your report does is explain, I guess, this terror, the effect on communities psychologically, economically, educationally, and so forth. Tell us more.
Sure. The mainstream U.S. debate has depicted drones as precise surgical weapons that are a key part of the campaign to counter terrorism internationally. What we really thought was missing from this mainstream debate was the voice of those that actually live under drones, the perspectives of those communities that has been largely absent from the mainstream U.S. debate. So our report, we went to Pakistan in two separate investigative trips. We interviewed 130 people, including 70 that have direct experience with drones. Those include those that have been injured themselves in strikes, includes those that have lost family members fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters in strikes, and those who live in communities that have drones flying overhead 24 hours a day. And what we found surprisingly was that the mere presence of drones overhead, even among those people that haven't directly been affected in strikes themselves, has caused significant trauma among civilian populations. We spoke with doctors, humanitarian workers, who told us about the effects that range from anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a range of other conditions. And these kind of effects have really affected everyday life in North Waziristan. We heard from many that live in these communities about how it's affected educational systems. You know, many admitted to us, and I should mention they were embarrassed to admit to us that they had to pull their children from schools. Others reported to us about how they're afraid to congregate in groups of more than 2 or 3 people, because not only have drones targeted, high-level targets, which mainstream studies put at about 2% of casualties, but in many cases have gone after people based on patterns of behavior that are unknown to the communities that live under drones. And that has affected other aspects of life, including jirgas, which are a key community institution in the federally administered tribal areas. And communities have been unable to go to this key tribal adjudicatory body to resolve their disputes. And effects have also taken place in people being afraid to attend funerals, and in many cases family and friends being afraid to go and rescue others from strikes for up to 6 hours after they take place, in light of the U.S. policy of secondary strikes. So I think really what we found most surprising in our research were these undocumented effects on everyday life, holding entire communities in a state of real terror.
I mean, and beyond that, actually, it was interesting to note, I suppose many in the media could have found this out for themselves, though, that the blast radius of Hellfire missiles is 15 to 20 meters. Of course, there's shrapnel beyond that, which particularly, can affect so many people. This idea of pinpoint surgical strikes is perhaps a misnomer, especially with the architecture of the compounds which are often being struck.
Absolutely. I mean, you have in many cases, we heard from interviewees, families that live in compounds of 50 or 60 people. So even in those instances where strikes have been surgically targeted at particular high-value targets, in many cases you have undocumented cases of women, of children, of other people that simply have the misfortune of being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And the way that, drones maim is really hasn't been accounted for. I mean, in many cases we heard stories of the destruction of bodies so severe that they're even unrecognizable in many cases after the strike. We heard accounts of incineration. We heard accounts of deep organ damage as a result of drone strikes. And so I think it's important to realize, what it feels like to be in a community in which there are members that have suffered this significant damage, to the point that it's very difficult to even provide a proper burial. So I think, even if we accept that these strikes are surgical, which I think our report casts significant doubt on, there are a lot of undocumented effects that are taking place.
Christine Farr, in the past you've argued that because we don't have exact casualty figures and you find local accounts of what happens on the ground lacking credibility, that we should in many ways just trust the authorities and the CIA.
No, actually that's a caricature of my argument. So my argument has been, and it also applies to this report, howsoever well-intentioned, that the methodologies of the report are really simply unacceptable. So let's speak to some of the claims. I have no question about the intentions of this effort, but it really falls short of the claims that they make. So the 130 people they interviewed were pre-screened, and they admit this in their own methodology, by the Foundation of Fundamental Rights. So in terms, when we talk about scientific bases of a sample selection, this is so orthogonal. This absolutely violates the first principle of research. They're basically interviewing people who've already been pre-screened to meet the agenda.
The agenda being against drone strikes.
Yeah, of course.
Might not victims of drone strikes be against drone strikes?
Well, hold on. You haven't let me even finish this argument, so bear with me. Then you can attack me when you've actually heard my argument. So the Foundation for Fundamental Rights is an avowedly advocacy organization against drone strikes. So they've found 130 people who are then interviewed. Now, many of the claims that we just heard, unfortunately, have not been independently verified. And this, again, is where I get to be the mean methodologist, because that's my job. I teach this class at Georgetown. So, for example, let's take some of the claims about the munitions effect. I would find not only their report, but the efforts of BIJ, which is also reflected in the film you just showed, to be more credible if they actually had a munitions expert. So the Hellfire missile actually has many different kinds of capabilities. Now, the one thing that he did say was true. A Hellfire missile could come into this room, break the window, incinerate all of us. There would be nothing to bury, but the building itself would be intact. Some of the injuries of shrapnel, people again forget that where the drone strikes take place, with the collusion of the Pakistani authorities, I may add, they're taking place where, well, actually, the ISI gets every single tape of every single drone strike. Right there,
You know this for a fact?
Of course I know this for a fact. Otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here making an arse of myself saying so on television. For a fact, the ISI gets this. So this is one of the, we'll get there in a second about the different collusive forces that keep this in silence.
But I want to go back,
we're getting there. So these have been individuals pre-selected. These have not, none of their reports of injuries or their accounts of these events have been independently verified by talking to munitions experts who can talk about weapons effect. Now this is very important. Why? Because the drones happen where there's also a very high level of Pakistani terrorism. Suicide bombings, we have bomb factories that blow up, killing many people. There's also, in areas where drone strikes have taken place, conventional Pakistani military accounts. So many of the injuries that BIJ shows in its various documentary evidence are much more likely to be explained away by these other kinds of attacks. So you simply, just because someone says that this is true, in my experience working in Pakistan now since 1991, doesn't mean it is true. I also know
in
for
this
fact,
environment of complete opacity, then I mean the same could be said for what you're saying as well. Right? We don't know for sure.
So this is why, for example, this is in the ideal world. This is how this has to be done. We need to know who the U.S. and ISI are targeting. We need to know who.
First of all, before we move on, then, Omar, you better respond to some of those points.
You know what? Absolutely. I think Christine's argument has been very typical of those in the administration.